Vengeance of the Soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. Betrayal in the dark. It was a quiet night in late October, and I was patrolling the empty streets of our small Texas town. The air carried a heavy, ominous stillness that often lingers in the early hours. Not much happens in our town after midnight. Occasionally, a bar fight, or a stray animal wandering the streets. But that night, around 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled. I received a call. I picked up the radio, and there was a man on the other end. "Officer, please. I think there's someone in my house." I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. Then, just as he was about to say something, the line cut off. I tried calling him back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I contacted my colleague to trace the location. I stopped, squinting at the GPS. It was a location just a few streets away, near the edge of town. Something about his voice unsettled me, so I decided to check it out. I arrived at the address, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. The wind whistled softly, brushing through tall, dry grass. I checked the GPS again. The location was correct, but there was no house, just emptiness. In the distance, a faint light flickered on the porch of a farmhouse. I felt an inexplicable pull. I decided to walk to the farmhouse, thinking perhaps they might know something. I parked and approached the door. I knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. A young man answered. He looked tired, confused, and not at all like someone who had made a desperate phone call. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, squinting at me through the dim light. I explained the call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He shook his head. I asked if he knew of anyone else living nearby. The man shook his head slowly. "No, sir. There aren't any houses for miles." I thanked him and returned to my car, the unease in my chest growing stronger. I checked the radio again and tried calling the number once more, but it still went straight to voicemail. I decided to head back to the station, but as I turned the key in the ignition, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the back seat. I could only make out a shadow, a hunched figure barely visible in the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, reaching for the radio to call for backup. But before I could, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head, pain exploding as everything went dark. I woke up dazed, my head throbbing. My hands were tied, and the room smelled of damp wood and rust. A single bulb swung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. And then I saw him. It was my colleague, Jeff. His face twisted into a maniacal grin, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You didn't expect to see me, did you?" he sneered. "I've been waiting for this," he continued, pacing with a gleaming knife in his hand. "Do you know how long I've had to smile through your success, Brad? While I was stuck with scraps?" He lunged, pressing the knife close to my face. He started taunting me about how I was always calm and how he'd see how calm I'd remain now. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Blood trickled down my skin as he mocked me, savoring every moment. I waited, biding my time. His grip on the knife loosened as he got lost in his rage. When he leaned too close, I acted. I kicked his shin with all my strength, making him stumble. My hands were still tied, but I used my shoulder to charge at him, slamming him into the wall. The knife fell to the floor. He was stunned, giving me just enough time to grab the knife with my bound hands. I bolted out of there. Behind me, Jeff staggered out, shouting my name, but his voice faded as I ran toward my patrol car. I stumbled into the police station, bloody but alive. My colleagues rushed to me, their faces a mix of shock and concern. I told them everything. Jeff was arrested. He sat calmly, as if nothing had happened, but his eyes gleamed with malice. Weeks later, I drove past the place where it all began, but now I understood better. Sometimes, the monsters we fear don't hide in the shadows. They stand right next to us, wearing friendly faces. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, But there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
"Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George."
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient, and I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
"I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me."
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira, "Help you? Tell me how." Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment killed me."
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end, Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes. And finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed.